everyone. I'm going to invite our panelists, Wah, Robert, Powers, and Jeff to turn their videos on at this time. And I'm just going to welcome you all to this incredible author talk that I've been waiting so long to host for BART. So I'm the BART storyteller, and I and our incredible marketing team created this book club, One Book, One BART, to connect and celebrate you, our reading writers. So I couldn't be more excited to welcome you today. This is the first talk of its kind in BART's 5 decades of service. And I just want to thank you so much for joining us. And to officially kick things off, I'm going to hand the mic to our general manager, Robert Powers. Bob, I'll let you take it from here if you want to turn your camera on and unmute. Thanks so much.
Am I unmuted, Michelle?
You are unmuted.
That's the first start. And for some reason, it says you can't start your video because your host has stopped it. So I will put that back to you and to Manny to navigate.
Give us a second. Okay. Just one box was mischecked. Sorry about that, Bob. You should be able to turn your video on now. Right. There you are.
Got it. Very good. Very good. Thank you, Michelle. Very nice seeing you. I see we are sporting the same attire this afternoon, huh? One book, one BART. Okay, so thanks for the introduction. So if you don't know me, my name is Bob Powers, and I'm the general manager at BART. And I just wanted to thank everyone for being here this afternoon for our inaugural One Book, One BART author talk. Wanted to let everybody know on this call that the talk will be recorded, and that here at BART, I know personally that reading on our trains is a favorite pastime of many of our riders. And in launching a BART book club, we hope to honor look at the tradition of bringing together the vibrant Bay Area community of readers and riders, and keeping that community together. I think there's a lot of similarities between books and transit, and both have the power to transport us. Our trains connect riders to fun, to culture, to community, including the region's trove of independent bookstores, the libraries, and authors' talks such as the one that we're going to have right now. So before I introduce our esteemed guests, 2 of them, I wanted to note that we will be launching our fall book club in mid-September. So stay tuned for updates on that from Michelle and Manny at the end of the talk here. So let me introduce our special guests here. First, it's an honor to introduce Wah Shu. Wah is the author of Stay True, our first book club selection. The book is set in Berkeley in the 1990s, and earlier this year, it was awarded the 2023 Pulitzer Prize for memoir. Wah is also a staff writer at the New Yorker and a professor of English at Bard College. So welcome, Wah. And also it's an opportunity and a pleasure to introduce our moderator for tonight's talk, Jeff Chang. Jeff is the author of the acclaimed book, Can't Stop, Won't Stop, and which was named one of the best nonfiction books in the US of the last quarter century. Boy, that's crazy good, Jeff. Just what an accomplishment. Among his other accomplishments, Jeff has received the American Book Award, the Asian American Literary Award, and the USA Ford Fellowship in Literature. And so, boy, are we in good company this afternoon. And so with that, I am going to turn this over to Wah and Jeff to take things from here.
Thank you so much, Bob. Thanks so much, Michelle and Manny. We're both, I think, thrilled to be able to be here for the inaugural session of the BART Book Club, being BART writers, past, present, and future. I mean, any chance I get to be with my homie here, Hua, is just the awesomest. So what's up, Hua? How are you doing?
Yeah, no, this is a real thrill. As Jeff said, I just want to echo, thanks, Bob, thanks, Michelle, thanks, Manny, thanks, everyone at BART, in the government, people writing, if you're on a train right now watching this, salute. This is just I still remember when a person in my press told me that BART was starting a book club and that my book was going to be part of it. I was just, I was sort of irrationally happy. I'm like, that is so cool that they're doing that. And it's just an unbelievable honor. So thanks to everyone who has been writing, reading the book, doing both simultaneously, hopefully. And thank you to Jeff, one of my close friends and real mentors, for doing this with me. I'm really looking forward to it.
I think the mentorship goes both ways, actually. So I just want to make sure that folks know that. Yeah, man, let's get started. There's so many beautiful passages in the book. My favorite, I think, could be right at the midpoint of the book where you're describing your friendship with Ken. And because this is a book, obviously, about your friendship with Ken, stay true. And I was just wondering if you might be able to bless us with a little reading of it.
Of course. Right. So as Jeff explained, it's a memoir about, just kind of being a young person in the 1990s. And there are a few scenes where I am writing BART, because growing up in the South Bay, it was sort of that way to like get to an internship in Berkeley, living in the Silicon Valley, like drive to Fremont, take the BART. It was sort of this first taste of independence. And so once I started college, this isn't SpawnCon for BART necessarily, but, I would take BART to shows and do stuff like that. And so the book is about that period of life that I think a lot of people experience, where you're sort of beginning to figure out who you are in college, like in your late teens, early 20s. And for me, I tried to figure out who I was sort of in opposition to other people, and so this passage is about a good friend of mine who I made when I was in college. His name is Ken, and he's sort of a pivotal figure in the book, probably the actual hero of the book. Friendship rests on the presumption of reciprocity, of drifting in and out of one another's lives with occasional moments of wild intensity. When you're 19 or 20, your life is governed by debts and favors, promises to pick up the check or drive next time around. We built our lives into a set of mutual agreements, a string of small gifts lobbed back and forth. Life happened within that delay. I started a secret Santa exchange, only I was anti-religion, and I didn't want to call it that, so it became known as the secret non-denominational winter holiday gift giver. I thought college was where I would find my people, which I assumed meant people who dressed like me, listened to the same music as me, wanted to see the same movies as me, variations on the theme of me. But I realized, maybe too late, that all I wanted was friends to listen to music with. Someone curious enough to ask what something was and then reciprocate by playing me something by Styx or Christopher Cross or another artist I was far too cool to know. Ken devoured the tapes I made him, and then, like an encouraging parent, offered a song-by-song critique. Everybody likes something, a song, a movie, a TV show, so you choose not to. This is how you carve out space for yourself. But the right person persuades you to try it, and you feel as though you've made two discoveries. One is that this thing isn't so bad, and the other is a new confidant. Ken told me how he'd driven all over San Diego in search of the CD single for Pearl Jam's Jeremy because of a song called Yellow Ledbetter. I rolled my eyes as aggressively as possible. Clearly a ripoff of the Jimi Hendrix song. I dug through my records trying to find Little Wing, but Ken was elsewhere, following the song's fluttering guitar line, remembering a girl for whom he played it. Eventually, we struck a compromise. Before our finals, we would sit in front of my stereo and reverently listen to Yellow Ledbetter. It wasn't so bad. Then my choice, David Bowie and Queen's Under Pressure, would rouse us out the door. We lived for rituals, looking forward to the day when they would be so instinctive that we would forget how they started. There was still time to repay these gifts.
Thank you. Thanks so much for that. Oh man, there's so much in that. I mean, one of the things in there that I was rolling on the floor with was how Berkeley is a secret non-denominational winter holiday gift giver notion. That's so Berkeley.
Yeah.
And then just the beauty of the two of you sitting and listening to music together. It wasn't the scene that you had pictured maybe, but it was certainly the scene that you were with. And it's a beautiful thing because we get to this midpoint of the book, after you've had this introduction of Ken, in which you say literally the first time I met Ken, I hated him, and that I'm going from memory here, but something like a bad CD collection was a sign of moral weakness to you.
Yeah.
What do you think accounts for what happened? This beautiful gift of friendship that you were able to build with Ken. Like, I know you spend 200 pages outlining that, but
Yeah.
I'm just like, how do you still think about that these days?
I mean, I think that when we're young, we're just really obligated to feel things intensely, and we sort of feel things for the present. We don't really understand the past or the future quite as much. And so I think I was just intensely searching for my people, like my tribe. This is what I think everyone looks for when they're a teenager, when they enter into new spaces. And, there were a lot of things about him. When I met him, we were first year students at Berkeley in 1995. So I don't know if anyone on the Zoom is as old as you and I are. You're just sort of slowly categorizing people, being like, you seem cool, that's a cool poster, that's a cool jacket, like maybe we'll be friends. There was nothing about him that spoke to my sort of vision of what kinds of friends I was looking for. Like, he was in a fraternity, he was very confident, but I think I very quickly learned that he was just actually quite, open-minded and compassionate in a way that I thought I was, only I was not. And I very quickly just sort of learned that a lot of these like signifiers, a lot of these things that we sort of we use to sort of collage an identity together, they can be kind of superficial. And maybe this is probably something that people realize a lot more quickly than I did, or sort of in a more direct way. But like, while we were friends, like I think I began to understand that taste was important. Taste was political, and it's very suggestive of a lot of things, but it wasn't everything. And I think that's something you learn when you just have to live with other people.
I want to ask you a lot more questions about friendship, but one of the things that strikes me still is just how important, like, the 90s were subcultural, and it was so important for us to be able to mark ourselves who we were by what our tastes were in some ways, right? I mean, in high school, if you were listening to a certain kind of music, you could get pounded on, or you could be the person who was doing the pounding. You could get bullied, or you could be the one who was doing the bullying based on the kinds of stuff that you marked yourself with subculturally. I did that for you and for Ken. What do you think the role of music and taste was in the way that you defined yourselves in that moment?
I feel like that probably still happens to this day. It's just that there's so many more ways to communicate our taste and convey taste nowadays. I mean, most young people, like, you could meet people, like most colleges will have a Facebook page, right, where everyone can sort of sort themselves before they even arrive to college. And so I think that there are still ways in which taste, what you like, what you hate, it's still very important. These are like important fault lines. Maybe for my generation, there were just fewer ways to express that. Like, there were fewer things you could possibly be into at once because we just had access to less stuff. But I do think, I'm 46, which means that I was a teenager right when, like, alternative music, the chronic growth of hip hop, like all of these things are happening in the early 1990s. I am sort of the exact age to be very impressionable and to see these people and to think about, like, what does it mean that this person is standing this way, or this person is sort of like thinking about authority this way. And so I think my generation, that moment in the early 90s, mid 90s, like music was probably one of the cornerstone ways that young people figured out who they are, who they were, who they could be. Obviously, like Nirvana was really big. Of course, Nirvana was big to like hundreds of millions of people, but
Yeah.
they were sort of one of these bands. I think if you were a teenager at that time, you might have felt like you were discovering them,
Yeah.
alongside 100 other million people. But these were really important experiences that I think everyone took and kind of moved through their lives and did different things with those influences. But you couldn't really. It's sort of hard to convey how radicalizing it was to see someone like Kurt Cobain on the cover of Rolling Stone wearing a T-shirt saying like corporate magazines still suck, and just trying to figure out like how are you allowed to do that? Like, how could you be on the cover of the magazine making fun of what this magazine is? Probably pretty second nature to how advertising and culture works now, but at that time for a teenager, these were things that made you think that maybe we would figure a way out of these contradictions that had vexed older generations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you talk about youth in such a beautiful way. You talk about how you were searching for it was sort of a pursuit of small immortality. You're pursuing a modest kind of infamy. And I just think that so well captures what it feels like to be young and signifying, literally, through your clothing, right? You make a lot about your clothing, where you got your clothes, how you source them from your grandfather's closet. And the first time that you really see Ken is when he asks you actually to take him clothes shopping. And so all these different kinds of markers become a way to build, I guess, that immortality that you're talking about. Is that what you're kind of getting at?
Yeah, I think, I mean, again, it's sort of strange. I teach college students, and so I'm always very hesitant to talk about my own past as though it was somehow like a superior experience than, what other people experienced sort of in other moments. But I think one of the things that I really tried to do with the book wasn't to say this was like a great time, but just that these were the limitations of my time. And this is what we did with those limitations. And, I was making zines. I was, involved in little like subcultural communities, but nobody thought that anything we did could actually make an impact. We could make a viral video or come up with a meme or publish something that could sort of take off in these exponential ways. That wasn't really part of the thinking at that time, at least for my friends and I, or sort of people who are into what I was into. And so, you wanted to do something meaningful, but you were also really conscious of how limited that blast radius could be. But, you sort of intensely wanted to kind of make your own small contribution to the world through art or through writing or whatever it was we were into.
Yeah. There's two things that came out of that for me. First is the humility of not wanting to be like, oh yeah, I was there when Kurt Cobain was alive, that kind of vibe, right? Which I think actually is not so much humility, but it's a little bit of a defense mechanism, especially for those of us who went to school at Berkeley and had to hear ad nauseum about Berkeley in the 60s, which is a whole
absolutely
thing, right?
Yeah.
That's just like, all right, we're tired of hearing about that. I mean, you come in and you're like, wow, free speech movement, People's Park, like third world strike. And then like by the time you graduate, you're like, all right, I'm done with that. I never want to hear about it again. So there's that humility thing going on. But the other part of it too is I wanted to ask you this question, because one of the really interesting things to me about the book is just me, like on public transit, seeing people reading your book. And like part of that is like super pride, because it's like, oh, that's my homie. Like, I'm so proud of him. I'm so happy that people are reading his book. I'm so happy that people are reading his book in public, but there's a way too in which like people have taken to your book in the same way that you took to Kurt Cobain, or you took to Pavement or Povil, right? Or Master P. I noticed P is like a
That's true. Yeah,
thing
that's a
for
good
you,
point.
right?
Yeah.
But people have like really grasped onto your book that way. I mean, I've met people on airplanes because of your book. I've been like, oh man, you're reading that book? Like, and then we get into a whole conversation about it and stuff. And so one of the things I was wondering was sort of this transition, right, from this sort of subcultural space to like, what does that mean now for you to actually get another P here, a Pulitzer Prize, right? Like, how are you actually like processing that, to use another P word? I got to stop with this alliteration thing. Yeah, hit me. I've been wanting to ask you that actually for ever since you won the prize, and we spent the whole night dancing around the table because you had. So
I mean, first of all, it was just it was just it was just such a bizarre thrill because it wasn't something that I thought I'd been thinking about, or it didn't seem like a plausible thing to even dream about. So,
another
that was,
another
I
P
know,
word right
I
there.
know,
Plausible.
I did that.
Nice, very
but
nice.
but it was, yeah, I mean, I've never seen anyone reading my book in public or anything like that. That would be really strange to me. But it is pretty bizarre, I would say. I mean, I've been working as a journalist for quite a while. I don't traditionally write about myself. Like, I'm not really I don't foreground myself in my writing normally.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of the things that happened that struck me as odd are things that people understand if they write about themselves. I just hadn't thought about it that much. So the fact that I turned myself and my friends into characters is pretty weird, because then they have these lives that go beyond the page, and so, I think that there's certain ways in which people associate with myself, with Ken, with people in the book, in ways that I associated with characters in movies or characters in novels. And it's so obvious that this should happen, but I did not, I didn't think that it would be relatable in that way, because I think I was still so stuck in this framework where I thought, like, this is such a singular experience. Like, this is, and again, this goes back to the Berkeley thing where everyone thinks that you're experiencing something unique, but you're actually all sharing in a pretty generic experience, but you just have your own kind of unique version of that experience, So I think I thought, I think I thought that, like, no one will ever understand how unique I was back then. And then people were like, oh yeah, I was into all the same things you were. I was just like you. And so it's very cool and unexpected that the book allows people to, reflect on their own friendships, their own connections, their own communities in ways that was never the intention. Like, I was really just trying to figure out something for myself and for people who are really close to me. So for it to have that life beyond is it's tremendously moving to hear about from folks.
Is it uncomfortable? And before you answer, I just want to say that one of the best pieces that you ever wrote, and I can't remember where you published it now, was about the concept of selling out and how it was such a thing to folks who came of age in the 80s and the 90s, and by the 2000s it wasn't anymore. So that's maybe a little bit of a preface to that question of, like, is it uncomfortable? Is there a way in which you're like, well, wait a minute, those are my memories. These are my folks. These are my people. Like, you don't have any right to come up to tell me, that this is what this means to you. I don't know. I just wanted to ask that question.
I don't necessarily feel like the aggression you're talking about. I mean, I think
that's not who you are.
I mean, it's weird because I feel like there's like a space that sort of grows small and smaller where you feel like that is, I mean, there's a lot that I left out of the book, or there are certain things about the way the story is told where I was able to, like, kind of keep stuff for myself and for people in the book. But I do think, you mentioned this concern that people in the 1990s, less so now, had about selling out or just sort of overexposure, or just feeling as though, your story is now just part of this like market of narratives and whatnot, right? Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly. Those are the themes I think that you were sounding in this particular piece.
Yeah, and I think that if you grew up during that era, it's sort of hard to take. It's always in the back of your mind, right? You're always thinking like, what does it mean for something to actually be successful? Like, why do people like this? It's there's a very kind of critical dimension to it that I think maybe people before or after are kind of less attuned to, because I think a lot of the pillars of success in the pop culture space when I was growing up were people who were kind of wary of being seen as though they were representative of everything. Like, I think you and I are both technically like Generation X, even though that spans people who are born over like a 15-year period of time.
Although generations are fictions, of course.
Yeah, all generations are fiction, right? But I just remember being a teenager and people would say like, this is the person who's like representative of Generation X. And then they would feel like this burden, but also like a misery that they had to somehow be representative of something. So I think if you grew up under that sort of understanding, then you're sort of like, what does it mean that people are so what does it mean to be representative of a larger group, whether it's like me being like a Californian or Asian American. I think one thing that's really powerful to me though is that we do live in this moment where there are a lot of Asian American stories out there, and there's no necessary kind of way to write an Asian American memoir the way I think maybe in the 1980s people might have felt more boxed in, like they had to tell the story this specific way. But there are many different approaches now, and I feel like I benefited from there being before me, especially in recent history, who was kind of expanded the parameters a bit. And then if you look at like television and film, there's just a lot of different ways of telling Asian American stories or experiences. So yeah, I don't feel that pressure that we're talking about necessarily, but I also think that being a child in the 90s, you're always just sort of wary of these things too.
Yeah. Viet Thanh Nguyen, who is also a Cal grad from the 1990s and also Pulitzer Prize winner, calls it narrative plenitude. Gosh, we're really rocking with the P's today. And that we have a little bit more of that these days, and maybe that's a little bit of an inoculation, somewhat against this feeling of the burden of representation, I suppose, feeling like you have to be that, which is also, I think, the protective stance, right, or that people took when that is sort of at the heart of the dilemma of crossing over or selling out, or that kind of thing that we were so concerned about in punk rock and hip hop during the 90s. Yeah,
I mean, I personally, as I was writing it, I didn't really think about these things, even though I think about them a lot when I'm writing criticism or journalism. But I was just really trying to figure out my own story and how to capture these very mundane moments of being young, of being with your friends. And once I was able to kind of create that world and kind of move people around in it, then I stepped back and thought like, oh, there are aspects of this where this will be seen as like an Asian American story, and that's sort of inevitable. But it was really something I'd been working on since the late 90s, just trying to figure out how to describe, like, the sky just looks different in the East Bay compared to the South Bay. The sky looks different in California compared to the East Coast. How to sort of capture these feelings that I really associate with a time and place of, just hanging around Berkeley, trying to scare up some dinner, things like that. And so once I was able to do that, really, that sort of like that sort of world building, then I realized that like, obviously this world exists within this, like these broader contexts of like ethnic stories, Asian American stories, California stories, stuff like that.
I want to take that into two directions. One is literally about kind of splitting the atom, I suppose. And then the other part is about what happens when these worlds collide, these worlds that you're creating on the page and how they recollide back with real life. But the first question really is about this splitting of the atom. Sort of how did you make the transition from writing about this as a subject within your own story, right? From the pages of your journals, which you began writing literally that day after you had heard that he had passed away, he had been murdered. You know, and then where you get to the splitting of the atom, where you're able to see yourself as a character on the page. I love that conversation that you had with Ken Chen, our good friend Ken, and how you talked a little bit about that. But you've got in this intro, which to me is some of the most beautiful writing I've ever read in my life. These first 4 pages of your book, you're saying, you kind of conclude at a certain point saying, for a while you were convinced that you would one day write the saddest story ever. And there's so much going on in that, right? There's the foreshadowing, of course, but there's also a confidence in the writing that's not suggestive of you as a character, but of you as the writer writing about a character.
Yeah.
And then there's the distancing piece, right? The second person, the writing about it not from the first person anymore, but suddenly it's like you. So tell me about that, how you got to, in your process of writing this memoir, move from this ball of stuff that happened to you to something that you could hold at a little bit of a distance to be able to describe it and write it and construct it in a way that you would write about any topic in the New Yorker.
I think it was just the passage of time. When I started writing my journal kind of immediately after we heard the news about Ken's passing. And in that moment, I was just writing from within the moment, you know, trying to figure out how to describe, you know, the agony we were feeling, or just kind of what it was we were missing, like cataloging. You know, once you lose someone in your life, you're so conscious of the fact that that narrative has ended and that you must now protect that narrative, or you must now like archive this narrative. And so, you know, I started writing. It's not because I thought I would become a writer someday. It was just a method of coping. As the years passed, as I kind of worked on my skills as a writer, I realized that, you know, it was just very difficult to write from inside the experience, because the only people who understand the experience are those who kind of shared in that experience, you know, even though those are the people I was writing for and for myself to some extent. But, you know, as I got older, I realized that that I needed to understand what had changed in me as a result of losing this friend, and what impact this friend had had on me, and that I had to kind of step outside of my feelings, right? Or at least the sad feelings, and just sort of dwell on the fact that, you know, you could be joyful and ecstatic, but also sad and devastated at the same time, that this is just what life is, the capacity to hold these different feelings. And that just came with age. And I think getting older and thinking about and beginning to doubt some of my own memories, or doubt some of my own feelings with age. And then realizing that, you know, even when we're experiencing things, and even when we're sort of like trapped in our feelings, like these are stories we're telling ourselves, you know, that we're sort of anchoring ourselves in some kind of narrative through line. And so I think recognizing that, it just sort of made it easier for me it was still very difficult to step outside of it, but it made it easier for me to understand that, like, I had to treat my younger self as the character, and not as like a truth teller who I was just a conduit for, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think you had talked about it in terms of the insight that you had gotten from Ken when you were both fellows at the New York Public Library, about how he loved the parts where you dunked on yourself, I think was the words, yeah?
Yeah.
And well, I guess one of the pieces within that is, you know, what were some of the other alternatives in terms of the way that you were going to construct the book? I mean, an intriguing thing that you dropped in there where you're like, yeah, I wrote 30 pages about the funeral. And so I just am like, what are some of the other, you know, alternative state truths that might have been written, you know, as you're
Well,
moving through this process?
well, it's a pretty slim book. It's like
Mhm.
100, it's less than 200 pages.
Yeah.
It was maybe like 300 pages. It could have been much
Wow.
longer. Like I
Uh-huh.
thought this was a history of the 1980s and 1990s with
Mm.
a personal story threaded through it. But I sort of began thinking about it. You know, you and I are of a similar age. So, you know, there's like the 60-minute mixtape, the 90-minute mixtape,
Mhm.
the 110-minute mixtape.
Right. Yeah.
I always felt like I could make, like, 60 was too short. 90 was the perfect length mixtape for me to make my friends.
Mm.
110, 120, that's too long of a mix for me to make for someone.
Uh-huh.
And I just felt like this story, as important as it was to me, it wasn't necessarily a story that needed to be told at like extreme length. Does that
Yeah.
make sense? Because ultimately, if I'm honest, it was like 3 years of a life that at that point was like, I don't know, I was like 44 or whatever. So the
Mm.
idea of, you know, even though it cast this shadow through the last 25 years of my life, if I was really to kind of dwell on all of the things I remembered, it was like this brief, incredibly intense period of life that sort of had this lingering effect on who I became. But focusing on that brief, incredibly intense friendship, it seemed right for it to be on the shorter end of things rather than like a really long book. So
Mm.
that's sort of how I thought about it structurally.
Mm. And
A book
just for
that one could read on the train, you know.
yes, and which I've seen many people doing. And just a little note for those of you who are writers who are listening in right now, you can literally map out Hua's book by quarters, by halves and by thirds if you wanted to, and see how he's mapped out the beats in that, which it just astounds me in order to be able to hold that, and to be able to separate that and be in this type of piece where you're talking about something very deep that's happened to you that in a lot of ways shaped who you become as a writer,
And as a person,
just powerful.
you know.
And as a person, absolutely. Yeah. Let me get to this other side of the question that I wanted to ask about this thing around when worlds collide, and then let's maybe like open it up for questions from our audience. Although I could obviously ask you questions all day, and I think we probably need to do it some time over a cheeseburger or something. But the other question is when worlds collide. So you're writing about real people, people who have lived and people who are still living. And I wondered how, let me phrase it this way, you know, sort of using the language of a firstborn Chinese Hawaiian son. What did you feel as a responsibility to those people whom you are writing about in the book? And how did that affect the choices that you made in the way that you told the story?
I felt more responsible for the other people in my book than I did for myself. I mean, I often say that I'm like the butt of many jokes in the book because, you know, I'm sort of, it's easy for me to make fun of how pretentious I was as a teenager, you know. But I think that when you're, you know, when you're young, and I mean, I think it's just sort of the loyalty of friendship that you think like, no, my friends are the smartest people. My friends are the coolest people. My friends are like the most beautiful people. And I really wanted to kind of preserve that sense of how I felt at that time. Like, no one will be like, this friend of mine is like destined to be the greatest X, Y, and Z, you know, just that you really believe in each other as friends. And so I really wanted to keep that sense of respect and awe. And that's what I tried to do. Like it was in a way, it was very easy because I feel like I elevated a lot of my friends because that's truly how I felt, but also because I could just make fun of myself the whole time because I was the one who was secretly very, insecure, judgmental, all these things. And that made it easier for me to kind of protect or shield them or kind of treat them as characters. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Like this wasn't necessarily the kind of memoir where I was revealing like a terrible secret that involved someone else. Like this was really just an interrogation of, of like kind of the intensity of emotions when we're young. So I tried to kind of hold on to that and celebrate it.
Yeah. Well, I had to ask a question because for me, it speaks to the ethics of writing. I think, especially as journalists, as people who are nonfiction writers and that kind of thing, the model that's held up for us is to betray our subjects. And what you've elucidated here is that doesn't need to be the model in some respects.
Well, I mean, the book is about like young people being friends with each other. So, I mean, the things that I think my friends found, troubling were things where they're like, I don't really want anyone to know that like I was that drunk. You know what I mean? Things that weren't about like spiritual failings necessarily, because again, like when you're young or when I was young, I didn't think about that. I was judging people by their CD collections, but I wasn't necessarily judging their like character, or their like their souls. And so I think staying within that framework of what it was like to kind of see the world that way was, it made it easier for me to never feel like I was actually betraying anyone.
Michelle, we can certainly take questions, but I've got a million more if we don't have any here. So we could bend people's ears for hours and hours. Do you want to go ahead and explain the Q&A process here?
Yeah, so we're going to go ahead and open it right now. It's going to just be you're typing in a chat box, and I'm going to kind of pick questions out and read them aloud for the two of you to answer. But cool. I thought I would kick it off with questions of my own. So I just have to say I was a student at Berkeley in the 2010s. And it sounds like your experience was just like way cooler than mine with like, like pavement.
No, we don't mean to, we don't.
Yeah, we're not trying to aggrandize our generation.
I had One Direction and like Imagine Dragons. So I just,
we had equally troubling things. So
nostalgia,
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask, so like Berkeley to me was this place of like joy and discovery and experience and maturity. But like you, it was also a place of a lot of emotional turbulence, including grief and tragedy. And, I live a few miles down the street from campus. And even now it's a little hard for me to go back. And I was just wondering, like, I'm sure you've been back, and what does it feel like? What's the experience like?
I go back every time I'm in California. And I think it's because I just love Berkeley so much. Like I love the city. I love the campus. For all the, like I had such a deeply impactful time there, like good and bad, obviously. So I go back all the time. And before I went there as a student, like the first ever internship I had was in Berkeley, but I was living in Cupertino where I grew up. And so my mom would drive me to Fremont. I would take the BART, and then I would walk all the way down Shattuck toward, I would just walk like a mile down Shattuck to work in this office. And so like, it's always been this magical place to me, even before I went there for college. And now obviously it's very much tinged with this feeling of like sorrow. But I also, writing the book was a chance to remember kind of the highs that made the lows so low as well. You know what I mean? And so it's just, and just kind of knowing that it's the place where like Jeff went. So like I met our mutual friend, Oliver, many people in my life, whether it was like classmates or people who I've met after graduating. It's just a place that, like living on the East Coast now, I think about Berkeley so much, and just kind of the different places I would walk to and the different things I would eat. So it's very much like this heavy place to go back to, but I go back all the time whenever I can.
Wow, thank you for that. So I'm going to read a question from
Sure.
Oliver, and it's relevant.
Oliver, our friend
Oh yeah,
Oliver.
maybe.
He says, what about Berkeley of the 90s really lingers for the both of you?
There's so many ways to take that question. I think for me personally, it was just, I don't know, just a sense that we were living inside these contradictions, which I think everyone is always feeling, but that like we would figure a way out of them. I think there was something just really exciting about, Jeff made the joke earlier about how when you get to Berkeley, you're sort of like forced to watch Berkeley in the 60s, and then you sort of measure your entire experience against this generation and these other moments. Yeah, I just remember a sense of, just being able to be like deeply despair, like feel political despair, but also political hope at the same time, be like hating the stuff that was popular, but then like really championing the stuff that was like the dude selling tapes on Telegraph, I mean, to this day, I mean, there's just so much about that period of time where that I felt really high and really low at the same time. And I still think about that a lot.
Yeah.
Maybe that's just the 90s in general. I don't know.
It's interesting because there's a way in which you are generous about threading the 90s through a lot of your work, even at the New Yorker. I mean, I've been thinking about you writing about Eddie Zhang and writing about affirmative action and Asian admissions, and writing about all these writing about anti-Asian violence even, right? There was the case in, was it Vacaville or Santa Rosa?
Rohnert Park.
In Rohnert Park, right, of Mr. Kwong. So it's important. It feels important to be able to talk about this. I know that there's been a lot of talk in the hip hop world about a recent series that's been done about hip hop podcasts in the 2000s, but I think that the 90s are a real lost history, and I've found that even in as much as we're so conscious of not trying to aggrandize ourselves and what we live through to our students, that when we explain the 90s, students go, oh, I get it. I see where the culture wars came from. I see where all these things came from. And I just think Hua has been able to do that in his work so beautifully. The one thing I will say is one of my crystal clear, beautifulest memories is of being able to be there in the basement of what used to be Barrows Hall, and which his name has been changed for good reason, because Barrow was a racist, at Oliver Wong's radio show, and hanging with Hua there, and just being a little part of something, just hearing him beam out into the night all of these underground records and into the Berkeley, Oakland area from the underground. So shout out to Oliver.
Awesome. To your point, Hua, my dad went to Berkeley in the 60s, and I think he greatly exaggerates his involvement in the free speech movement. So
sounds like it was a really fun time. So
yes.
So I've got one from Danielle, and she says, thank you so much for sharing your story. It was a beautiful read. As a Taiwanese American, it makes me happy to see more and more AAPI stories out there. One thing, among many things, that resonated with me was your ending and your comment. Therapy is awesome. Therapy and mental health isn't talked about much in our community, and I'm curious why you chose to end on this note. And if you have any more comments on therapy and healing from trauma. Also, if you find yourself in the Bay over Labor Day weekend, come to SF Zine Fest. I'll be there.
Oh yeah. All right. Awesome. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So, I mean, this is no spoiler at all, but the sort of like the final scene of the book takes place in a therapist's office. And I mean, I think it's a bit ironic though, because I think in the reality of that moment, I was completely misinterpreting what this therapist was like telling me to think about or to do. And it's something that I didn't truly grasp actually until 20 years later, when I talked to a friend who's also a therapist, and I was like replaying this moment for her. And she was like, oh, that's actually not at all what this person meant to do or say. But it was really useful to kind of think about how rarely I would have, like, even me, someone who is sort of obsessively living in the past and thinking about these moments and thinking about the impact that this moment of trauma had on you going forward, like, and who used that in order to like motivate me to do the, like, I didn't really think about my own like mental health that much. I was very much just like, I am processing this through writing. And that was certainly part of it, but I wasn't necessarily processing it through, seeking out, objective or sort of like trained professionals to talk about things with, or even my loved ones necessarily. So yeah, like that final moment where I'm in the therapist's office, it's slightly kind of making fun of how blinded I was to certain forms of help that were close at hand. But it is also just a reminder that, that these things really matter, and that it always helps, I would say, to talk through some of these problems and to sort of interrogate the narratives that begin to feel like truth in our minds, when in reality they're just kind of narratives that we might be telling ourselves over and over. It's something I actually think about more now than I did then.
Mm-hmm. I also wanted to just note too that some of the beauty of the ending is where you suddenly make the leap in your use of you, right? And the second person, you shift from second person to addressing Ken directly. And that's sort of an indication that it's not going to be a happy ending per se, but there's healing that's beginning to take place.
Wow. So another one, we have one from Kaylin, who says, as a Taiwanese American who also went to Cal, I think there's a lot of Cal grads.
Awesome. This is great. I love this.
Today. This book resonated with me to my core. So thank you for putting into words what I've always felt about my college years in such a special place. If you're comfortable, can you please talk more about how your relationship with your parents evolved towards the end of the book versus the beginning?
Of course. There's this sort of dovetails with the previous question. So the book kind of begins with an extended description of my upbringing. My parents, Taiwanese immigrants. I grew up predominantly in the Silicon Valley. And, they were very supportive. They're very supportive people. And my father moved back to Taiwan in the 1980s. And we kept up, we faxed back and forth. That was sort of our main method of staying in touch. And over time, I think they were just sort of, as with many first generation immigrants like them, they were just purely focused on survival. They were purely focused on the present. They weren't dwelling on their past. They weren't existential about their futures. They were just working in order to provide for me and to sort of provide for themselves. And I have this line in the book where it's like the first generation thinks about the survival, like the second generation can tell the stories. And so I was always really fascinated with the arc of their lives, with the narrative of their lives. And I think over time, our relationship continued to grow, but I think that they didn't necessarily understand why my friends and I were so destabilized by our friend's death. They understood the tragedy of it, but they were sort of like, well, you're not like his brother, you're not his sister, you're not his mom and dad, you're just his friend. You need to continue living, and I think that was very much born out of their perspective and their kind of worldview as these first generation Americans. And so, yeah, throughout the book, our relationship sort of shifts around that, because I think it took them a while to kind of understand who I was as this kind of Asian American as opposed to them being these first generation immigrants. And, you know, and it does sort of speak to that conversation with the therapist that the previous question touched on, and just thinking about where it is we learn how to feel, like where it is we learn how to express ourselves. And so it always starts with family, but there are also ways in which your family may not provide all the answers for that. And so that was something that I was really trying to work through in the book.
Awesome. So this one's from Dave. This is going to be our last one too.
Sure.
Any current music recommendations? What are you listening to these days?
Gosh, you know, I can never answer this question, which is very strange because I write it. For a while, I wrote a lot about music. Thanks, Dave. Thanks to everyone who's been part of this. You know, this has just been a real honor, and it's been such a blast to, you know, get my brain picked by Jeff. I don't really know. Jeff, do you have an answer for this? What have you been listening to while I quickly pull up my listen to
your
history?
playlist?
Yeah.
Probably for me, still a lot of Pharoah Sanders of late. And I've been really obsessed with this 12-inch, I guess from a few years ago, by a guy named Konstantin Siebold called Mutter. It's like this techno track, which I think he would like. I also want to say this too. Hua made the best mixtapes. Hua and our mutual friend Dave Tompkins always made the best mixtapes next to Oliver's. Oliver's was usually mixed, but Hua was just like selecting songs, and I learned about so much obscure European radical commie punk and very obscure European techno from Hua at different points in my life.
Wow, that almost sounds like an accusation. Yeah. So I've been, for the past couple of years, I've been like really obsessed with this guy Duval Timothy. He's like a pianist, beat maker. He had this album came out last year called something Judas Tree. It's so beautiful. Duval Timothy. He I think he like worked with Kendrick in the past. He's really great. Dave, the UK rapper Dave, I really like. He's got a really cool thing that he did with called Split Decision. That was pretty good. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I feel like my listening is a little all over the place, but one of our mutual friends slash like mentors, Greg Tate, passed away 2 years ago now. And he oversaw this band Burnt Sugar. It was sort of like this improv big band, like Afrofuturist big band. And I've been listening to a lot of their old stuff, and it sort of brought me back into this guitarist Morgan Craft, who was part of Greg's ensemble. So I've been listening to a lot of Morgan's old stuff lately. So if you get a chance to check it out, Morgan Craft, Duval Timothy, Dave.
Awesome. Thank you for answering the hard question.
Yeah, no, I feel that it took me that long to figure out. So,
okay.
Also, I should shout out Earth Dad. They're this band out from New York that played my book launch party last year, and they learned how to play all these 90s alt rock songs in this like ambient style, which I absolutely love. And I actually put it out on a tape. So if anyone's interested, they're called Earth Dad. Just look up Earth Dad, Suspended in Time, and it's on Bandcamp. It's like these like Foo Fighter songs done as though they're the Darude column. It's just
nice.
Heard, so.
Cool.
Very nice. Very nice.
I will definitely be checking that out. So on that note, I'm going to conclude this wonderful talk. Thank you both so much for supporting the BART Book Club and public transit at large. And this incredible community I mentioned of our writer readers. But I want to make a special announcement before you all leave, because you showed up to the talk. Keep your eyes on bart.gov/book club, because on September 18th, we are launching our fall book club. And the title is On the Rooftop by local author Margaret Wilkerson Sexton. So stay tuned. We're really excited. And a lot of the reason we're doing another one is because this was such a success. And I think that's in large part thanks to Stay True and how much it resonated with our riders. So
it's unbelievable. Thank you. I mean, I'm honestly like so touched that I was part of this. I felt like I can like barely call myself a Californian anymore because it's been so long since I like lived there. But yeah, it means so much that you know, to be part of this. So thank you.
take care. Well, thank you all. Have a
Yeah.
wonderful night.
Thanks everyone.